In this video, we're continuing section 1.4 on factoring, and we are going to focus on factoring expressions that have 4 or more terms. Okay, so let's get right into the steps for doing this and then get into some examples. So the first step is to factor the common terms, if there are any. After we do that, then we try to factor by grouping. Okay, so let's talk about how this works with an example. So I want to factor the expressions below. So in problem 5, I have this 4-term expression. So I got x cubed. Remember, when I have a plus or a minus, that separates terms. And then my next term is the 2x squared, and then I got the minus 7x, and then that minus 14. So 4 terms. So when I group this thing, often what I'll try to do is put some of the terms together and another set of the terms together and try to factor each of those groups individually and then see if I can take that further. Okay, so when I do that, it's really tempting when I form my groups to do stuff like the following, where I put a parentheses around a group and then a parentheses around the other group. But if I just do it like that, I've changed the meaning. Because if I have one parentheses times another parentheses, what that means is we are multiplying. But that's not what's going on with these first 2 terms and these second 2 terms. They're connected by the subtraction symbol. If I wrote it like this, though, they're not connected by a subtraction. They are being multiplied. So it's incorrect to put a parentheses around the groups like that. Okay, so that's a common error that I see that I want to point out. Okay, so how do I indicate the groups then if I don't do that? What I like to do is I like to put this little under brace below my group. So that's my group 1, under brace below this next group. And now I'll factor each group. In the first group, they have an x squared in common. If I take that out, I'll be left with x and then plus 2. From the second group, I could take out either a 7, because that's common, or maybe negative 7. And I might notice that if I took out negative 7, it's going to be kind of nice because, well, if I take out a negative, it changes the sign of those terms. So it'll become a positive x and then positive 2. And now this is especially nice because in each of my groups, they have a common term, this x plus 2. Okay, so because I have that common term, I can factor it out. I will factor that common term. That's often what we look for. That kind of indicates, oh, this grouping was the right one. I can take this further. So I take out that common term, which is the x plus 2. So when I have a common term, we typically write it in front like this. We pull out that common term. And now I ask myself, well, what's left over? So here was the first group. When I took out x plus 2, what's left over is that x squared. And then I go to my second group. In my second group, when I take out the x plus 2, what I'm left over with is the minus 7. Cool. So I've taken out that common term. I might ask myself, well, okay, the second parentheses can be factored further. The x squared is a perfect square, but unfortunately 7 is not a perfect square. So I can't really take that further. Okay. All right, so I'm going to box this. This is as far as I can go. So I've grouped it to get the answer. Awesome. Let's take a look at another example. All right, so example 6. I got x squared minus 6x minus y squared minus 6y. I'm going to do this in 2 ways. One of them is not going to be right, and then one of them is going to be right, and I want to talk about the differences. Okay, so first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try grouping these first 2 terms together and these last 2 terms together, because that worked out really well for us in the last problem. So let's see what happens if I do that. So the first group, x is common, and if I factor that out, I'll be left with x minus 6. And the second group, y is common. I could take out positive y or maybe negative y. Maybe I'll try negative y because that was kind of good for us in the last one. So that'll leave me with y and then plus 6. Remember, because taking out a negative means I switch those signs. Okay, at this point, what I'm going to ask myself is, well, if I look at this first group and I look at the second group, do they have a common factor like I had in the last problem? Like in the last one, I had these x plus 2's in common? Well, in the first group, the two factors are there's x and there's x minus 6. Well, the second group does not have x as one of the factors. It also doesn't have x minus 6 as one of the factors. It might be tempting to say, wait, there's a 6 here and a 6 here. Can I somehow factor those out? But the 6 isn't itself a factor. The factor that it's part of is over here, it's x minus 6. And in the second group, it's the y plus 6. I could ask, is x minus 6 in both of them, or is y plus 6 in both of them? But I can't just take out 6 itself, because that's not an entire factor. So at this point, unfortunately, in my two groups, there are no common factors. No common factors. Okay, so that's kind of a bummer. I'm going to put a sad face. Okay, when that happens, it doesn't mean that it doesn't factor. What it means is I need to try a different grouping. This just wasn't the right grouping. Try a different grouping. Okay, it's really, really common that when people get to this point, either they'll say, oh, that's as far as it goes, or they'll try to make up some math to make it factor when it doesn't. But when you get here, you just want to recognize, okay, no common factors when I grouped it this way. Got to try to group it differently. Okay. All right, so let's try to group these things differently. So what I want to do is I want to give you maybe a minute to think about this problem and see, can you find a grouping that seems to work better? Pause the video in 4, 3, 2, 1, pause it. Pause it and try this for 1 minute and see if you can find a grouping that is more successful. All right, hopefully you did that. Hopefully you paused it for about a minute. Let's talk about it. All right, so if it turns out if you put these square terms together and you put the x term and the y term together, it works out better. If I factor the squares, well, that's a difference of squares. I'll get x minus y times x plus y. And with the minus 6x minus 6y, let's factor out a negative 6. And that'll leave me with positive x plus y. And now in my two groups, well, they have this x plus y factor that's in common. So I get to factor that out. So I factor it out, I write it in front. I'm factoring it out, so I write it in front. I'm going to highlight it. Okay, and then I start a big old parentheses, and then I write all the leftovers. So from group 1, when I took out the x plus y, I'm left with x minus y. And in group 2, when I took out x plus y, I'm left with minus 6. And those are all my leftovers. Okay, and well, none of these parentheses, factors further. There's no more common terms. These aren't perfect squares or cubes, so I can't do more with this. That's the correct way to do this thing by grouping. Okay, it's really common when you're doing grouping problems that the grouping that you try first might not work. So you want to be on the lookout for that. That's very normal. With more practice, you'll get better at recognizing which group might be the correct one quicker. But give yourself some grace and patience. It may take multiple tries to get the grouping that's the correct one. I also want to just quickly note that sometimes we'll need to group 3 terms together and leave one term by itself. And we'll see examples of that later.